Hello and welcome to the webinar for May 2014. This is part two of a webinar series that we started in April. Last April we talked about bin and location management for SAP Business One and how that had changed in the latest version 9.0. And today we're going to be talking about inventory cycle counting. Just before we start that, I'm going to make reference for those of you who may not have heard about this service. Project Line's launched a bit of a premium training service for Business One. So this is really meant as a supplement to the already great content that you're getting as part of your annual maintenance, but more in a different form of kind of short to 30-second to 3-minute training videos. If you'd like to know more about this service, you can log on to projectline.ca, and on the support tab, there's a link to this site, and feel free to send us a mail and ask us more. So this month we'll be talking about inventory cycle counting and how that process has changed a little bit in the version 9.0. We will be kind of covering the process overall, so some of this may be a little bit of a review for those of you who have been using cycle counting previously. But for those of you who haven't used cycle counting, this should be a good overview of the cycle counting process and how you could use it in your company. So what's new? There is a new end-to-end process. There has been new functionality established within the project that that essentially, I guess, has changed things enough that they're saying that things are kind of refreshed or new from an end-to-end standpoint. Alerts in SAP Business One that relate to cycle counting have been extended, and we're going to show you how you can kind of launch a counting process right from an alert. You also now have the ability to have multiple inventory counters. So 2 people take inventory instead of just one and submit 2 counts. The ability to freeze items and to save the count history. Okay, so here's a bit of the laundry list as far as what's changed in Business One. This is a busy slide, so I think probably we'll cut to a bit of an example fairly quickly. And a bit of a rehash of what we've already stated. But on the second slide here, probably the major thing to point out is that there is a new standard dashboard within Business One that allows you to get a view of what's happening from an inventory perspective. So part of this particular dashboard is an inventory valuation. You see there's a little bit of a window onto when your last cycle count date was, and where you counted last. And then there's also a little bit of a inventory risk perspective, so items in certain warehouses, and this is a little bit of a calculation that describes when were things last counted and what were the value of the items and so on and so forth. All right, so in order to get to the place where we're actually doing cycle counting and having SAP recommend cycle counts for us, we need to do a little bit of setup in the background. All right, so if we pop over to our Business One system, we're going to go into the administration area. And again, not everybody has access to the administration area, so this part is really more for those system administrators and power users of Business One that drive the setup. We're going to go into the setup folder of admin and drill down into the inventory area. And we're going to open up this object called inventory cycles. Here's where you're really defining how often you count certain categories of items. So later we're going to apply these count categories to items themselves or item groups in particular, but now we're really defining the categories of items that we need to count and how often those categories need to be counted. So A items are defined as things that we count on a weekly basis every week on each Tuesday. We've set up B items as being every 2 weeks on a Wednesday, and we've set up C items as being monthly on the last Thursday of each month. Okay, so different organizations will have different inventory cycles. What's appropriate for you really probably has to do with what's required in your organization to keep inventory straight. It's often a kind of a question of the time and expense taken into account. Is that justified in the context of what you want to accomplish? Do you have fairly high value, rapidly moving inventory that can go out of whack fairly quickly? If so, you may want to count certain items more frequently. There are some organizations and some items that really wouldn't need to be counted more than once a year. Okay, so if we go into the cycle count determination, so we've set up our categories of inventory counting, and we can see now that we're able to do cycle count determination first on the basis of warehouse, and then further on the basis of either item group or warehouse location. This is something that wasn't previously available in SAP 882 and previous versions because really there was no bin location management in the standard version of SAP Business One. So because warehouse number 44 is a bin location managed warehouse, we now have the ability to define cycles for on the basis of inventory locations within a warehouse. We're just going to kind of keep it at item group level. And our general warehouse isn't bin managed, but if I double click on the line for our general warehouse, we can then define the cycle categories, the inventory cycle category that each item group falls into. So in this particular case, IBM and HP printers, we feel that those are category A items, count every week. Accessories count every 2 weeks, and servers and PCs count every month on the last Thursday. All right. This is also where we can prompt Business One to include an alert for cycle counting, and being able to put an alert against a cycle count recommendation is not something that's new. But what has changed, if we drill down into the alerts window for Business One, is, and we find a alert that corresponds to some recommended stock taking, we'll see the report of the items that the alert is recommending stock taking for. We can actually select those items within the alert, and we can launch the inventory cycle counting process right from the alert. This is something that is new and has changed in Business One. Okay, so if we go back, that's really the setup that's behind the inventory cycle count determinations. All right, so now we kind of get to the business of working with the cycle count recommendations. And again, what we've just set up in the back end essentially allows Business One to recommend cycle counts to you so that you're not having to go in and say, okay, well, you need to count these items. The system is essentially telling you, what you said you want to count on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis. Do you agree, and do you want to create a count list? And go ahead. So many, in many organizations, cycle counts are truly just driven from the alerts window in this stock taking required alert. However, you may have somebody that is specifically designated for inventory taking, and in that case, they may go to the inventory area into the inventory transactions folder and open up this cycle count recommendations selection criteria. This is really the tool that an inventory control manager would use to generate those cycle counts. So those cycle count recommendations are coming in those alerts, but this is kind of more by hand, I guess, for lack of a better term. So if the inventory control manager says, you know what, today we need to count A items in the general warehouse, and click OK, we're going to get a list of all of the A items that we should be counting in that general warehouse. So we could select that entire list, and then we can click on this button in the middle bottom part of the cycle count recommendation screen called inventory counting. and it's going to generate an inventory cycle count list for us to use. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and add that into the system. Oh, and we got a bit of an error. Okay, so we just have an item here that, or a group of items that I think are on different lists and aren't going to work. So we're just going to, actually just going to back up here. We're just going to select a certain range of items. Okay, so we have some open documents with these items. And what we're going to do in this case is we're just going to select the one item because I'm fairly certain that this 1312 is not in an open cycle count. Yeah, so there we go. We've got an inventory cycle count for this one item. With the inventory counting form in front of us, we can now see that there are some extended capabilities available within inventory counting. And at the top part of the screen here, you can see that it says counting type single. We're actually going to select the validation count. This is where you can have more than one inventory taker. So our first inventory taker is going to be Jason Butler. And the inventory takers can either be users on the Business One system or just somebody from the employee record. It could be somebody that's not within SAP Business One. So we're going to, Sophie's in sales, but she's had kind of a rough month, and we're going to put her on inventory duty so that she can see all of the stuff that's kind of sitting around waiting to be sold. All right, so we put Sophie on that document as well. This is the point at which if we create this document and we want to freeze these items, and when we put a freeze on this particular item in this cycle count, what it's going to do is it's going to prohibit anybody else in Business One from being able to transact against that item until it's unfrozen, until it's counted and reconciled. So not everybody will want to do this, but this is provides the ability to be able to freeze that item in that particular warehouse and potentially in that particular bin location. So if we had multiple bin locations where this IBM printer is present, then we're going to actually see multiple entries in this list. It might be warehouse 1, bin 1, and then we have another line for warehouse 1, bin 2 type of thing. And that can be frozen. Those separate bin locations can be frozen individually. All right. If and when we'd like to print this off. So in this particular workflow example today, we are simply printing it for our inventory counters. However, there are, in some companies, they feel that including let me rephrase that. In some organizations, you would have an electronic handheld device that would you would be able to do cycle counting through. We can certainly look at that with you. Some of you might be using add-ons that support cycle counting, and those add-ons would then need to kind of come up to speed as far as some of the new functionality in Business One. But in this case, we're going to just print the sheet off for our counters, and you have an option to either show what quantities Business One thinks you have, or hide it. And some people would actually choose to hide it because they believe that by showing what Business One thinks is in stock, it biases the results of the counter. And in some environments, they feel that it actually helps, because if it says 802 and both counters are counting 800, maybe they'll take a little extra care to find those two items that are, say, on a different shelf or someone else. So this is an example of the form that gets printed, and then those two counters would go ahead and add in their values for that count on those IBM printers. They'd return the paper. Once the inventory control manager got those counts back, then he's going to take the paper, find the line. Oh, I'm just going to hit update on it. find the line that they're on. And we can see that in this particular case, it's not allowing us to directly add a count to the sheet. It's because this particular item has different units of measure that it is present in. So instead of allowing the inventory control person to put in directly into that field so many quantity, it's possible that the inventory counters may have counted individual pieces or cases of items or what have you. So it's asking us to further drill down and provide a count on each unit of measure. And in this case, we just have one unit of measure. But if these printers came in cases of 6 or something like that, and we counted a case, it would automatically translate, how many cases into how many individual printers. So in this particular case, we're going to put a counter one count of 802, and the second counter actually counted 804, and we're just going to hit update. Okay. So when we come back to this count, we're going to see that counter one counted 802 and the second one counted 804. So there's a bit of a disagreement on what the actuals is. At this stage in the game, you may return these types of items that are flagged as having a variance back to the counters to say, listen, we've got a bit of a disagreement on what the inventory levels are. Can you go back and check? And more often than not, in those cases, the counters will come back and they'll agree on a count level, and it may even be exactly what the system says you should have. Let's say they come back, we send them away to count, and counter one was an error. We in fact do have 804 of those particular printers. So we update their count, and counter two agrees. So in this case, we're fairly certain that there's 804 of these and that the system is reading incorrectly. So we need to know what to do with these counting. Okay, so we can either take the count that counter one has counted or counter two, or in cases we can post items with a difference of 0. Now what this means is if counter one and counter two agree so that the difference between the two of them is 0, we can take those items and correct them, or we can go, if the counters don't agree, we can go with either counter one's count or counter two count, I guess, whoever you trust more. In this particular case, we're going to select the option items with counter difference 0. And what this does is it says, okay, counter one and counter two have agreed that the level of this item is actually 804. We're going to create an inventory posting slip, an inventory correction slip that will adjust the inventory level for this printer. And in this case, the variance is +2, and this is the value actuals associated with that +2 change. And if we go ahead and we add this inventory posting, it's going to create a journal remark in the back end. So if we go back to this inventory reposting and we drill down into the actual journal entry, we're going to see that the correction has been made in the gain loss inventory variance account. Okay. So that's really kind of the new end-to-end process. Again, it's similar to the old process with some new additions. So just to recap, we looked at how we could use multiple counters in the cycle count process, how we could freeze items, how bin locations now factored into the cycle counting sheet, and how we could count different units of measure for the same item. And then we also saw how we could enter the counts for the two counters, we could choose what result to go with, and then we could make a decision on how to make our correcting entries. Lastly, we'll just quickly review the inventory counting transaction report. So for those of you who haven't seen this report already, this is often something that's used by particularly by accounting controllers to kind of see what has happened on the inventory side. So we can kind of filter the inventory counting transactions report based on certain item codes or suppliers or item groups or even warehouses. In this case, we'll just kind of leave it wide open. And what we get is we get a report generated on the inventory correcting postings that have been made as a result of the inventory counting and control process. So we can, an accounting controller or a business manager can kind of then review those changes and, might uh, filter the report on the basis of a certain count date and just see how many problems had occurred with that particular count. All right, so this concludes our webinar today for May on inventory cycle counting and how it's changed in SAP Business One version 9.0. If you have any questions following this session and you'd like to follow up with us, feel free to email us at your project line email account. So that's that sap.yourcompanyname@projectline.ca. We'd be happy to answer any questions related to inventory cycle counting, whether you're a company that uses cycle counting or would like to. Tune in next month where we'll be discussing topics related to customer relationship management and sales opportunities.